Adam is the head of engineering strategy, has tons of experience in the public sector, on technology sector, and also he's very fond of his Harley Davidson, which I really hope makes it into the presentation, but we'll see about that. He'll be talking about overdependence on third-party outsourcing and relying on insourced capabilities to digitally transform the way public services are delivered and consumed. I'm quite excited to see this presentation and basically how this has been delivered with GitLab blended across everything. So please join me in welcoming Adam to the stage. Adam, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for that introduction. So yeah, as you've said about me, I'm Adam Moss. I'm the head of engineering strategy at the Department for Work and Pensions. DWP is one of the biggest government departments in the UK, outside of the Ministry of Defence. We probably are the biggest, actually. I also lead 3 of our engineering job families, so tech leadership, site reliability engineering, and DevOps engineering. There is a long and tawdry story I could tell around why we have SRE and DevOps separate, but I'll not bore you with that. But if anyone is interested, feel free to hit me up later on. I spent 25 years working in and leading development teams, originally in the private sector, and then switched across to the public sector about 14 years ago now. So I've worked on everything from cutting my teeth originally on mainframes, so JES2, JCL, natural Adabas, for those that remember those things, right the way through to modern hybrid cloud things, the transition from waterfall to agile processes and flavors in between, and of course the rise of open source. You have mentioned that I do like to get out on the Harley. Sadly, it isn't in the presentation, unfortunately. But in my spare time, I'm also a scout leader. So for anyone that's never done anything like that, I can certainly highly recommend it. It's a very rewarding volunteering experience. So about DWP, who are we? As I've said, we're responsible for the welfare, pensions, child maintenance policy, etc., etc. We are the UK's biggest public service department. We administer state pension, working age benefits, disability benefits, ill health benefits to millions of claimants and customers. So to give you an idea of what I mean by that in terms of the scale, there's about 20 million citizens in the UK we support on a day-to-day basis. We have over 730 million benefit payments each year. And they total somewhere in the region of about 82.5 billion pounds. So originally, we were, as a lot of organisations, we went down the outsourcing route, outsource everything, and life becomes easy. And that was something we did for the best part of 35 years. So I do have members of staff that actually we've outsourced longer than they've been alive, which is a scary thought. Some of the issues this caused of us, technical diversity. I don't joke when I say you can literally think of a technology that's existed over that kind of time period, and you can safely assume we've got several different versions of it in production. Really simple example would be there are at least 97 different flavors of programming language in use. Okay. What does that give us? A lot of technical debt. The usual stuff you get with outsourcing, big bang implementations, lots of time-consuming and expensive changes, and fundamentally timescales for delivery that don't keep pace with the business. And ultimately what the business is trying to do. And then the one we all know and love is techies, governance, becomes an industry unto itself. It's really orientated around protecting the organization from risk, transferring as much of that away from ourselves as was, reasonably practical in an outsourcing model. The good old risk transference strategy. And what did that mean? Well, we had a ton of workarounds and off-system processes. And I'm sure, those of you that have the Microsoft suite in your organization with its beloved VBA macros probably, can resonate quite simply with that. So after, a long extended period of time, we decided we were going to transition to insourcing. And we did that in a really, really short time scale. So how short? I'm literally talking about between the announcement happening that we were going to do it and us insourcing the first thing, it was a grand total of 2 weeks. So 10 working days in real terms. That raised a few eyebrows when we actually got to see the level of technical debt, because obviously a lot of this is hidden when you have outsourced contracts. Things take longer, but you're never entirely sure why. And suddenly we got a real eye opener into the amount that we'd effectively inherited at that point. And we had some challenges with governance, obviously. Why did we have challenges with governance? Well, in an outsourcing model, a lot of it's around protection of the business and transferring risk to someone else. And then with an insourcing model, you're suddenly having to accept all that risk, and you don't have anywhere to transfer it to. So we saw some interesting changes to governance that were basically trying to maintain those same protections, but not necessarily take into account that it's now employees responsible for it rather than suppliers. Number of cultural differences we had in terms of approach, in terms of just getting things done versus long drawn out waterfall processes, write everything down and all that sort of stuff. Behaviors around learning and development, that's an interesting challenge. Who is responsible for learning and development? Is it the organization and the line management chain, or is it the individual themselves? And then of course, as we've said, workarounds, off system processes, trying to look at those sensibly and say, okay, which ones of those are legitimate, as in they're desirable and actually we need them in the core, those features in the core product, or which of those actually are less desirable and actually we just need to transition people away from using them. So we decided at the same time we were going to transition across to Agile, and that was literally it. We went Agile. That was the statement. It was literally an announcement. From now on, everyone is working in an Agile manner. So what were some of the challenges we got with that? Well, the obvious one is there are multiple flavors of it, right? It means different things to different people. So we had professional Scrum appear, we had Kanban appear, we had certified Scrum appear, DSD A-turn appeared, SAFe has appeared, and we haven't quite seen Prince 2 with Agile appear, but that is a thing, it does exist. And the by far the most popular one we saw appear was Agile in name only. Yeah, so we'll use all the modern buzzwords, but we'll not actually change any of the processes. So that's a very popular one that we still see today, actually. And of course, governance, agile governance is a challenge where people are used to waterfall processes and effectively signing things off, and suddenly you're asking them to do all those things, but within a 2-week window, so you can deliver stuff. So that's caused a few interesting challenges, and they continue into a lot of other business processes as well. There's a lot of waterfall processes in there, whether it's annual budget recent planning cycles and things like that. They all can be interesting challenges to try and solve. And one of the ones that we had a lot of difficulty with actually was some of the stakeholders, so the end users of our products, and why were they a problem? Well, it was more because after 35 years of outsourcing, they basically had a learned behavior, which was if it wasn't in the first release, it wouldn't be delivered ever. So when you started saying, okay, we're going to work in 2 weekly sprints and you'll get a drop every 2 weeks and things like that, there was a lot of disbelief and a lot of mistrust, shall we say. So when you talk about minimum viable products, we would jokingly say, no, we're actually talking about maximum viable products. So that's been an interesting challenge for us to solve from a business perspective. So what are some of the realities for an engineer? Well, there's some good points, right? So they finally got official recognition, right? So even though we'd outsourced for 35 years, we still had, software developers on staff and things like that. They were just never officially recognized as software developers, which meant, they'd end up, as I would say it, abusing certain systems. I can tell you it is entirely possible to roll an Access database out to 60,000 people, but I would equally say I would highly not recommend that. All right. But that is one of the things that was done at one point. They finally got access to appropriate tools and technologies. So whether that was programming languages, they weren't just restricted to the things they could cobble together in Visual Basic macros, for example, within the Office framework. They could use proper development frameworks, make life easier, reuse code. Yeah, they finally got version control that wasn't saving something as another file name. And databases, yeah, they could get proper relational databases rather than, rely on desktop tools like Microsoft Access. They got some flexibility. Yeah, they could choose the way they work. They could choose the most appropriate tool for the job, which is, again, a thing a lot of people sometimes struggle with, where they'll default to, well, I've always wrote this in Java, and it's, okay, but there's another bunch of languages there you could use. Choose the one that's better fitted. And they could start adopting open source, so they could consume and reuse pre-built components, and hopefully reduce the time to market and their overall development effort.
Hi, we are Eficode, and we organize the DevOps conference. Regardless of where you are on your DevOps transformation journey, we would love to have a chat with you and help with your next steps. We have seen many examples of what successful DevOps transformations look like. You can find us at eficode.com. The links are in the description. And have a great time with the DevOps conference talks.
Of course, with the bad, there's some of the good. With the good, there's some of the bad things that come along. So for the engineers, one of the first things they got hit with was device management. Okay, so their engineering devices were not unrestricted. They don't get pseudo access to anything, really. In fact, that was one of the things we had the biggest debate around. Does an engineer need pseudo access? And I think 3, maybe 4 years after putting device management into engineers, we're still in the less than 10 in terms of pseudo rules we've actually had to add to the platform for the engineers to be able to do their job. Very similar fashion, configuration management. So what sort of tools, how are they configured? What standards do they need to meet? The technologies, versions. You can't support every single version of every single product. How do we proxy stuff? Do we do TLS inspection and things like that? How do you configure development tools to recognize that you're suddenly doing TLS inspection? Because lots of them really don't like that. And how do we cache things to make sure that if an upstream thing disappears, that that doesn't impact us. And one of the other challenges we actually got was, again, with open source. It's great, it's reusable, it's free at the point of use, essentially. But that in itself drove an interesting set of behaviors. It meant that you could suddenly have more than one of something, right? So version control platforms, hey, let's install GitLab. And then another team says, hey, we want version control, let's install GitLab. And then before you know it, you have 23 different instances of GitLab running on your estate. So there was a few challenges like that we had to adopt. And then when we got past the bad, we got to the quite frankly, the downright the ugly. Okay, so the risk position of the organization very much orientated around risk avoidance, and now we're trying to transition across into more of a risk acceptance or a risk reduction model. And that's a very difficult thing for an organization to go through when, as I say, it's got a 35-year history of avoiding risks. It's suddenly taking accountability for the decisions it's making, and that can make people really, really uncomfortable when you have to spell out some of the implications of these things. Business applications. Okay, we have lots and lots of business applications, as I'm sure you can imagine. We have them, as I said, in some cases we have up to 97 different flavors of programming language. And suddenly we're responsible for everything. We have to try and maintain that. So you're looking at capability building and you know, how do you transition people to be able to do that? That was an interesting challenge. And again, open source reared its head. Open source reared its head more for, you know, occasionally there are actors in the open source community that will be deliberately vexatious or deliberately destructive. You know, quite popular thing in the Node.js community every so often, you know, whether someone wipes out the left pad module that, you know, 20 gazillion things rely on. But even more recently, you know, things like Faker.js, a tool for generating test data in different formats. You know, the author of that decided to cause a little bit of mischief. So, you know, things like that have caused a few challenges for engineers. We then said we're going to go cloud. So, you know, we're just going to adopt the cloud. So we started with private cloud, which is essentially on-prem data centers. We're then going to go to public cloud, you know, AWS, Azure, GCP, or our main providers. And more recently, we're looking at, okay, so how do we do hybrid cloud properly? You know, how do we make sure that the stuff that we need to stay private stays private, and the stuff that we can offload into the public area stays public? And how do they all communicate efficiently in between without undue overheads? So some of the challenges we got, you know, consumption of services. You know, there was no standard way really of automating consuming services across those different environments. You know, each of them had their own ways of working, their own tool set, their own processes. So that meant, you know, essentially, even if you wanted to deploy the exact same thing across those different environments, you know, in real terms, you were most likely building it 3 times from scratch. So, you know, you'd end up with 3 sets of everything, 3 sets of CI pipelines, 3 sets of deployment pipelines, 3 different sets of expertise, and, you know, all the ongoing overheads of having them. You know, and the impact of that is fairly obvious. You know, you've got slower deployment cycles. You've got, you know, a lot of waste in your engineering process, engineering time, and ultimately you're increasing costs. Default behaviors was an interesting one. I've always done it this way, therefore that's the right way. So that's always a challenge, especially when you're going through a transition, getting people to accept that, you know, what they have always done is not necessarily what is now desired. Doesn't mean it was wrong before, doesn't mean it's right now. And you know, having some of those conversations. Automation, that was a challenge. You know, taking people out of the mix and saying, you know what, we appreciate the role that you've been doing, but actually now we've fully automated it. So we need you to transition to a new way of doing things, a new role. And ultimately, the other thing that was always interesting was understand that when you're doing this sort of thing, there is no right answers, right? You can make mistakes, and you know, some people do make mistakes, and you have to accept that because it's a learning experience all the time. So what's our vision? So we want to make it easier for teams to build, certify, and deploy across our hybrid landscape. We want to eliminate the inefficiencies that come with building things from scratch. So reuse things where it's appropriate, share things, but make sure it's secure and integrated. Break down silos and foster sustainable and collaborative cultures of innovation. You know, the much vaunted 20% time and things like that. I would desperately love to get us to the point of view that we could do that. So how are we approaching that? So we have a platform approach. You know, we happen to use GitLab. I don't think there's any secret about that. You know, version control, it's just one problem domain for an engineer. But there are other things, requirements management, CI, CD, security. You know, these are all equally important. For us, we are really keen. Oops, I've lost. There we go. We are really keen to avoid a split brain problem where different types of information are in different places. So, you know, do you use GitLab issues? Do you use Jira, for example? I know what my answer is from an engineering perspective, and it's all around the cost of context switching and really understanding the cost of context switching. We're looking to achieve consistency with the things that matter to us to lower cost, increase outcomes, and improve knowledge. But we also need to recognize that a single platform can change our risk profile, right? So all our risks are in one place rather than being spread across several different places. So why does that matter? Well, back to the scale question. We have somewhere in the region of 1,000 engineers, 13,000 code repositories, around about 1 billion lines of code. And we run somewhere in the region of about 300 days worth of automated tests every day. So for those of you that like kind of, rough approximations, 1,000 engineers, roughly the population of the Isle of Skye off the coast of Scotland. 1 billion lines of code. It's the same calorific content as about 7.5 million portions of strawberry delight. 300 days worth of tests. That's about how long it's going to take you to get to Mars in real terms. And then the real big one, 173 million API requests every month, which is just about enough to fill Rugby's Twickenham Stadium 73 times over. 280,000 virtual machines every month, and we make somewhere in the region of about 6 million outbound calls every month. We have actually the most complex telephony estate on the continent of Europe. Looking at consistency, so we're looking at fully utilizing the licenses we pay for. So in our case, GitLab, reduce the complexity of our supply chain. We have adopted SaaS, so we are balancing some of the risks of using SaaS against the rewards of not maintaining things that aren't core to our business. We do recognize it incorporates existing well-known open source products, and that helps in reducing and lowering barriers to entry, not just of our own staff, but new hires and things like that. And because it's SaaS, we can pretty much guarantee on the 22nd of every single month, we're going to get some sort of additional value add, which essentially is free of charge because it's just rolled into our existing license. And that's one of the great things about GitLab. They are constantly iterating. So we're looking at securing our supply chain. So we're looking at consistent application of guardrails, appropriate ones. Make sure we have a verifiable chain of trust. Make sure we equally have an immutable chain of custody. And our roadmap will help us achieve this, as will some of our vendors, SigStore, things like that, throughout 2022. And one of the other things we have to remember, of course, is it's a journey. We've only really scratched the surface of where we want to be. There's a few things we have to do. Truly embracing agile methods, getting rid of all of that agile in name only. Building higher performance, asynchronous, stream-based processing rather than handoffs and things like that. Transitioning from DR to HA, making sure continuous delivery is the default. Some of the interesting things we want to do, more implementation of chaos engineering so that we can really improve, and obviously repaying our tech debt, and more importantly, actively managing the accrual of new tech debt. And then finally, one of the things I'd really like us to get better at, we do it at the moment, but really in a really small scale, is obviously contributing back to open source. Yeah, we use a lot of it, so we'd like to add stuff back to it. And indeed open sourcing some of our own stuff where available to do so. That's pretty much all I was going to cover today. The cheeky plug, if any of that sounds interesting and you want to join us, we are hiring. There's lots of different roles we are actively looking for today, so there's a URL there you can look at, or you can hit me up on the Twitters if you like. But other than that, I will throw back to our hosts for any questions you might have.
Thanks for that, Adam. As we wait for some questions to come in, there is at least one that I wanted to ask. I'd kind of like to ask the cheeky question of why is your SRE and DevOps separate, but I'll not do that. But I wanted to ask how you reached a tipping point that caused your transformation. Was there like a moment of realization And how would you identify that? And if you could, would you perhaps try and move that closer down the line?
So there was a few things, to be honest. There was obviously some changes in government policy around more adoption of open source and more embracing of smaller suppliers. And that was a government policy thing, to kind of break the stranglehold of the kind of the big four, the big five consultancy firms that typically win public sector contracts. We also had a number of concerns, from a pricing viewpoint, from a delivery viewpoint, from a quality of work viewpoint. That obviously over time it kind of bubbled up, and eventually I wouldn't say there was one kind of incident that was the straw that broke the camel's back, if you like, but there was just a reality that to maintain pace with government policy, to maintain pace with organizational change, organizational restructures, the demands of obviously the citizens, and more importantly the needs of the citizens, we couldn't rely on waterfall-based processes. I mean, if you take the pandemic we've all been through, could you realistically run a government department on an outsourced contract basis in that scenario? And deliver some of the outcomes that no one had ever envisaged before. Help to work. Some of the help schemes, the salary repayment schemes that were put in place by the Chancellor. How would you ever deliver them within the timescales that were required to the standards that are required? It would just be a non-starter in real terms.
Okay, and another question that I was thinking of was how your timelines are reflected. Because you work with such kind of large inertia-bound organization in the public sector, the timelines of how you manage transformation compared to how it might be managed on a smaller corporate scale, for example.
It's so that's probably a big source of frustration for me. So as you probably heard at the start, I said I did come from the private sector, and worse or better, depending on your point of view. I came from the private sector that was very, very much the Japanese way of working, which is exceedingly efficient and exceedingly so. I do find that a very frustrating things. There are things where I think, some things could ultimately be done faster if people were just willing not to be maybe liked as much. But equally, I think, there are a lot of things that we value more highly, which I've certainly seen where, when we recruit people from the private sector, they don't necessarily appreciate. So our stance on security, for example, we're looking after 22 million actually of the most vulnerable people in society. We don't mess around with security. Whereas in a private sector approach, you may adopt a slightly different risk position. We all know, like Troy Hunt's "Have I Been Pwned" site and things like that. I think it would not be very happy if one of our data sets appeared on there, let's put it that way. Whereas other companies, they take a more relaxed approach sometimes. It's never ideal, but, the impacts can be significantly different.
Okay, thank you for that one. There is one more question that's come in about the hiring, and has that been boosted? Hiring of talent, has that been boosted by Agile, open source, and DevOps?
So it's certainly so they are attractors to the marketplace, if you like. So certainly the challenge we have around hiring is getting people to understand it's not mainframes. It is cutting edge cloud, there's bleeding edge. We do have AI, we do have ML, we have all of these weird and wonderful things. We do a lot of experimentation to see where it is. And a lot of that gets lost in translation with our adverts, because our adverts have to, there's so many kind of processes they have to go through to ensure that they're fair and open, and they're not necessarily written in the way we would ideally like to express it from an engineering viewpoint. But certainly in terms of when we do talks like these and explain some of the technologies that we use, I normally get loads of questions from people, and they all generally start with, I really didn't realize you did that. And that's not just from a technology point of view, but it's actually some of the work we do as well. So everyone in the UK will be aware when you hit 100, you get a birthday card from the Queen, right? We're actually the people that generate all the data for that, so that Her Majesty knows where to send them. So it's just little things like that people don't actually realise we do. And like I say, but yeah, certainly in terms of when I think if you look me up on YouTube, you'll find talks I've done with some of the stuff we've done with Red Hat on Ansible, for example, and things like that. So we do use a lot of exceedingly popular technologies, and the big difference, as I say, is we use them at a really big scale, which again, a lot of people don't quite realize.
I actually always wondered about the birthday card from the Queen thing, so it's good to know you're the guys behind it. Maria, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, since we have one, we definitely have to take it. Please go ahead. Let's have that one and then move on.
Okay, so we've got the last question. Actually seems to be from our next presenter. And he wishes to ask, how do you address the mindset change, which is around new tooling, new tech, and DevOps at that execution level?
It's really hard, right? So people want the kind of familiarity zone, and obviously there are tools and tech that can help things, and that can breed a set of behaviors which are not desirable, especially when you're looking at something like automation and you're saying, well, actually, you no longer need to do this piece of work because the system's going to do it for you. You have to have very clear conversations with people around what that means to them, and automation is a one that's great for me. I always say to people, look, we're going to automate this particular process. This is your opportunity to say, right, the process is right, it's wrong. You want these rules in, you want these rules out, you want more than you've got now, you've got less than you've got now. You have that flexibility, and ideally what I want to do is spend half an hour teaching you a bit of YAML so you can start writing those rules yourself. And even if they're not a finished product, at least we understand, and you're starting to contribute to that. So at some point, ideally, we can hand that over to you and just say, right, that's your process. You can add rules into it whenever you want. And because the benefit we get is we know they're repeatable, we know they're consistent, we know they're automated. So actually, from a risk point of view, you fiddling with that is really minimal. But yeah, it's always a challenge, and there's always that balance at an enterprise between being at the kind of the cutting edge, bleeding edge, versus the more stable edge. We are trying to introduce continuous evergreening, which is again part of the strategy for dealing with technical debt. So how do we keep things up to date? But there's also a bit of education around some of the things that constantly crop up, like vendor lock-in, right? What do we actually mean by vendor lock-in? Is using C# a programming language vendor lock-in? Is using Java vendor lock-in? Versus using RDS as a managed database service. So I think it's a bit about understanding what people really mean when they use some of these terms that they throw around, and really getting into what their concerns are with them.
Okay, that sounds good. We did have one more question, if we can very quickly get to it. If you just have some short advice on how to get the teams to be more engaged and make this part of their journey, maybe a couple of sentences on that.
So for me, it's understanding the benefits to them. Okay, so if you read the SRE handbook, it talks quite a lot about toil. So get rid of all the things you really don't like doing by automating them out of existence, essentially, and drive that consistency and that value add from that. And when you've done that, you can concentrate on the things you do enjoy much more, and you're never having to go back to kind of those things that do drag everyone down. And everyone has a different kind of threshold of what that is. And I think it's, for an individual team, say, what are our pain points? What do we as a team really not like? And then just spend a little bit of effort focusing on getting rid of it, because it will be achievable. It's just sometimes it means you have to ask those awkward questions, but don't be afraid of them. No one ever gets into trouble for asking a question. They may not like the answer they get, but it's better to be clear than have a set of presumptions that may not be valid.
That sounds good. Thanks for answering that, Adam, and thanks for joining us and giving us your presentation. It was very enlightening.
All right, thank you very much.